So I bought this book about 10 years ago to learn how to bake sourdough bread. And all I can say is that it worked. Within a couple years, I was baking all the bread at the restaurant I worked at as a line cook. And a couple years after that, I was working as a professional baker in a bread bakery. Sure, there's a ton of content out there, a lot of blog posts, a lot of even videos breaking down this process, specifically this recipe. But the one thing I think it lacks is that little bit of professional touch. Like, how would a pro level baker do it? What are his hands doing to the bread? And I think I have that insight. At this point, my hands have touched thousands of pieces of sourdough bread, and I have a pretty good handle on the process. So I kind of want to show you guys a little bit of the tips and tricks of how I would break it down from somebody who's worked in a professional bread bakery. And I just kind of want to pay respects to our boy Chad, because without him, I would have never learned this process, something that I care about so much and is really close to my heart. So stick around, we're going to get in the weeds a little bit. This is definitely not a beginner level sourdough video. So if you want to see that, head over to this video. We put that out a few weeks ago. That's how you make it without a stand mixer. Check that out if you're interested. Let's get started. At the time of shooting this video, it's 8 a.m. I fed my starter about 10 p.m. last night. That feeding was 25 grams starter, 100 grams all-purpose flour, and 100 grams water. At this point, it smells sweet and only slightly sour. It's got a really nice gassiness to it. At this point, the starter is like peaking. It's got a really high population of yeast in there, and it is definitely ready to go. Leading up to this feeding, I've been feeding this starter once in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon. Definitely not anything too strict. It doesn't really matter as long as you're feeding it. And I'm gonna leave the full instructions below for how to care for and start a sourdough starter in the description. We're measuring out 700 grams of warm water. Into that, we're gonna add 200 grams of our ripe starter. Like I said in a previous sourdough video, your house is much colder than a bread bakery. It does not have a 4-deck bread oven that's at 500 degrees all day, so I would skew towards 95 to 100 degree water. This was a real struggle for me early on in making this bread. It was always sluggish. I had to wait all day for it to ripen on the countertop. It was just because my dough was too cold. So once I started working with warmer water, things got a lot better, a lot faster. When your starter is ripe and ready to go, like ours is, it floats. As you can see here, it doesn't go down to the bottom, it stays right on top. To this, we're gonna add 900 grams of all-purpose flour and 100 grams of whole wheat flour. We're not gonna salt this yet either. We're gonna mix this on slow, and this is what we talked about in the last video. This is the autolyse. What we're doing here is hydrating the flour slowly over time. This gives us more extensibility and a more tender, supple dough later on. We want to slowly hydrate this dough. We're going to let it sit here for about 30 minutes. At that point, we're going to add in our 20 grams of salt, and we're going to mix this on slow speed for about 2 minutes. This been mixed the first slow mix at the bakery. We would do this in a giant orbital mixer that has 200 pounds of dough in it at a time. We would do it for 4 minutes. At home in a small mixer with a small batch, we only need to do it 2 minutes. After 2 minutes, we're gonna pop up the speed to sort of medium, high, medium, and do that for 2 more minutes. To me, there is a difference between doing it by hand and doing it in a stand mixer. It's not huge, but it's just a little bit more consistent with the stand mixer, and it's a little bit cleaner. Hand mixed dough can be really good, but you need a little bit more experience to make it really good, and you have to do it almost every day. I made 12 loaves a day by hand for about 3 years, and by the end of that 3 years, I was pretty good at it, but the first year or so was a little bit rough. I wish I had a mixer. After the second 2 minutes of mixing, we're gonna transfer our dough to a plastic container to ferment. I'm putting a little bit of olive oil in there. And by the way, this is an IKEA container called the Samla. It kind of mimics what we would use at the bakery. They use full-size bus tubs with lids, and I think there's like 9 or 10 kilos of dough in there. I prefer this to a tall round container, which they show you in Tartine. This is a little bit closer to how we would do it in the bakery. At this point, we're gonna throw on a lid and set a 30-minute timer to come back and fold our dough. After that 30 minutes, we're gonna pop off the top and grab each side of our dough with wet hands. We're gonna fold it over like this and repeat it 4 or 5 times, rotating the tub each time. We're gonna throw the lid back on this container and check back in another 30 minutes. So it's been an hour and the dough definitely has some life going on at this point. It looks very pretty, very shiny. It's kind of got a smooth satiny texture at this point. It's starting to get a little bit stronger since our first fold. We're gonna do one more round of folding here. This time we're gonna make sure to get some tension by tucking the dough back under itself a few times before we lid it up. I'm still doing the pull and stretch, but at the end here, as you can see, I'm grabbing the dough, kind of tucking it under in a big mass. It's kind of hard to describe what I'm doing here, but in the end, you want to make sure it's kind of like one big mass that's kind of sitting on a tucked bottom. And you get this really nice tight top. We're gonna let that ferment on the counter again for another 2.5 to 3 hours. About 3 hours later, our dough looks really active and it's risen really well. It's grown about 40 to 50% larger than when we started, and when you touch it, it's buoyant. It's clearly got some nice gas in it, and it looks enlarged and kind of gaseous. I'm gonna grab my dough scraper and we're gonna go around the outside the container, loosening the dough, and then we're gonna flip it out onto a floured countertop. We're just looking to divide the dough into 2 roughly equal pieces here, and then we're gonna shape them into rounds. The move is to tuck the loaf under itself in kind of like a circular motion. This definitely takes a little bit of practice, but the only way to get there is to do it a bunch of times. So make more bread tomorrow, make more bread the day after that. Once we got our dough kind of tucked into a nice round, we're gonna put a tea towel over it, set a 20-minute timer so this bread can relax. When we come back to shape, we're gonna lightly flour our proofing baskets or bannetons. If you got 20 or 30 bucks and you wanna be baking more often, you can get a set of these off Amazon for pretty cheap. I think I got these 2 for about 30, 35 bucks, and that included shipping. So highly recommend that. Don't get them at Sur La Table or Williams Sonoma because they're gonna charge you like 45 bucks each, and it's the same thing. So I'm gonna show you how to shape this bread more than I'm gonna tell you. When I first got started baking, I really wanted to make bread exactly like they did at Tartine, so I was digging the internet, searching tirelessly to try and find videos of how Chad Robertson shaped the bread, and there wasn't really any good stuff on the internet 8 or 9 years ago. Eventually, some stuff came out, and I learned from Ted Wilson, my sort of bread mentor, how to shape, kind of combined the Tartine method with his, and here we go. I'm kind of tucking these things in to create tension in the loaf, and then in the end, I'm sort of doing this baker's roll over the top, as you can see here. For a simpler and nearly as effective bread shaping method, check the beginner sourdough video I mentioned before, link below. Once both of our loaves are shaped and in the baskets, I'm gonna cover these with a tea towel and let them rise on the counter for about 90 minutes. It'll depend on how active your dough is and how warmed your water was earlier, / the temperature of your house, but it should look good at 90 minutes. If your dough is lagging behind it, it can take some more time, that's no big deal, but they should look like this before they go in the fridge overnight. An indent with your finger should bounce back a bit, and again, they should grow maybe 40 to 50% in the baskets. I'm gonna refrigerate these overnight to build some flavor and to finish out this fermentation. The next morning, we're gonna preheat our oven to 500 degrees and throw our Dutch oven in there to warm it up. It's the morning, and I usually give it 34 minutes. I make a pot of coffee, answer some emails, and I come back with semolina in my first loaf. I throw the semolina in the Dutch oven and on the loaf for good measure, and I gently flip it out of the basket, and then I cut it with scissors. You can use a razor blade or a serrated knife, but scissors are always in the junk drawer right next to my stove, and I just like the way it looks. It kind of gives it a rustic pattern, and it kind of tears open the top of the loaf. We're gonna throw the lid on this Dutch oven, throw it in the 500-degree oven, turn that oven down to 485 degrees, and then we're gonna set an 18-minute timer to get that oven spring. After 18 minutes, we're gonna come back, take the lid off our Dutch oven, make sure that we're doing okay in there, and then we're gonna throw it back in the oven for 25 to 30 minutes, and I'm gonna turn the oven down another 25 degrees so that we can slow that caramelization a little bit. If it's a wet dough, we need to bake out some of the water. We don't want it to take on color too fast. But that's it, we're gonna pull them out. They should look like this. We're gonna let them cool for at least an hour, and I'm gonna throw the second loaf in, same deal, 18 minutes at 485, and then 25 to 30 minutes at 465. And if we did our job right, we have Tartine style, Chad Robertson approved country bread at home. Look at this thing. We're snacking on bread. So that's the classic Tartine sourdough bread at home, made by somebody who's done it hundreds of times. It's a beautiful book to have on the shelf in your house, but it's also just really well written. And there's also tons of recipes in it about how to use the bread. Not just bread recipes, but like cooking with the bread. As always, if you got value out of this content, please hit subscribe, tell a friend. Thank you so much for being here. We'll see you next time. I'm a simple